We are continuing our study of the Gospel of Romans. And we are up to step 5, which is dealing with the congregation of Israel. Now let's look at what we've covered so far. In step 1, we learned that we're supposed to seek God through His Scripture. So each one of these steps, we're going to have to decide, are we going to go with our own viewpoint on things, or are we going to go with what the Scripture says about these things? And when we get into the congregation issue, this is a big problem because the way congregations are done today is very different than what the Scripture says. And so we're going to have to decide, are we going to go with what we're used to in the church system or in the synagogue system, or are we going to go with what the Scripture tells us that we're supposed to be doing with the congregation? The second step is dealing with the 2 sin problems. The first sin problem is dealt with in the third step, which is trusting on Messiah's sacrifice on the cross. That gives us forgiveness of past sins. The second sin problem is the fact that we continue to sin, the fact that we have a tendency towards sin, that we need to change. Okay? And the last 4 steps in Romans are dealing with this problem. And step number 4 was the primary way of dealing with that, and that is walking in the Spirit. If you're walking in the Spirit, you cannot be sinning, right? But the bugaboo here is, how do you do that consistently? And so the last 3 steps are going to talk about the means of doing it consistently. And so the next step that we're dealing with today is step number 5, and it's the congregation of Israel, and this is going to help us to live righteously. And in other words, we're going to get help from other people to help us to live righteously. Now you can look at the congregation of Israel from 2 different viewpoints. The first viewpoint is your personal viewpoint, and this is you connecting to the local congregation to get help for living righteously. The other side of that coin is looking at it from a universal viewpoint, and that is that when we connect to a congregation of Israel, this is our connection to the universal Israel. Okay? In other words, we connect to the family of God, which is called Israel, and we connect to the nation of God, which is called Israel, by connecting to this local community, this local congregation of Israel. Now, this is covered in Romans 9 through 11. And as you read through Romans 9 through 11, most of it is about Israel. There's very little of it that's actually about the congregation, but the congregation is how you connect to Israel. And so that is the real crux of the matter as far as you are concerned. But it is mentioned, let's look at chapter 10 in Romans. In chapter 10, verses 12 through 15. For there is no distinction between the Jew and the Gentile, for the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, and he quotes from Isaiah 52:7, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who flesh out the good things. This word, bring good tidings, that is from the Greek definition of this word for gospel. But we have learned already that the word gospel in the Hebrew, which is basora, comes from the word basar, which is flesh, and so it means to flesh out. And flesh out is an artistic term where you're finishing a painting. You start with a drawing and you start filling in all of the details and the colors. Now, what this means is that this is referring to the discipling system. You hear about it, you get involved with the discipling congregation, and you get trained up to become an apostle, where you are sent out to share the gospel with other people. That is the type of congregation that we're talking about here. We're talking about the kind of congregation that Yeshua set up with his 12 disciples, who all of them became apostles, were sent out in teams of 2 to set up new congregations. And this is the process that we're talking about. So this is the type of congregation that we are supposed to be doing. Now, you will hear a verse quoted quite often. This is Hebrews 10:25, and the church quotes this to say that you're supposed to go to church every Sunday, right? And it says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. And that's where they stop the quote, okay? Because what they're saying is you need to come to church on Sunday and give us money, right? But let's continue reading the verse, because the verse continues. They stop right in the middle of the verse when they quote it. It says, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Well, how can you exhort one another if you do not have a sharing venue? If you have a lecture venue, you can't exhort one another. You have one guy exhorting everybody else. This is saying exhort one another, a sharing venue. Okay, and this is the topic of the next book in Paul's letters, which is 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians tells us how to meet. And so when we talk about joining a congregation of Israel, we're talking about one that meets the instructions of the New Testament. And that includes the setup that Yeshua had in the Gospels. It includes the instructions of 1 Corinthians. And 1 Corinthians states specifically that we're supposed to have a sharing venue where everybody is sharing the gifts of the Spirit. So this is the kind of congregation that we have to join. We have to understand what kind of a congregation we're supposed to be joining, and then find one that meets that criterion and join it. Because this is going to help us. This exhorting each other, helping each other. We're going to help each other to live righteously through this sharing type of venue. Okay? But this is also going to connect us to Israel. Okay? So if you are, you can derail this in a couple of different ways. One is don't go to a congregation at all, right? That will derail it, obviously. Or 2, go to the wrong kind of congregation. If you go to a congregation that is not a sharing congregation that is operating according to 1 Corinthians, then you are not going to get all of the benefits that a congregation is supposed to give you. which means that you're going to have trouble living righteously. And that's exactly what you see in the church. You see all kinds of sin. The divorce rate in churches are just as high as outside of churches. Why? Because they're not using the instructions of the Bible. They're doing their own thing. Okay? So we have to join the proper kind of congregation. And then the third thing that can derail us is to insist that we are Gentiles, not Israel, which is what the church does. This is replacement theology. They say that the church is the Gentile church. And so you ask those people, well, what is the name of the church? Okay? And they go, what do you mean? And they got this deer in the headlights look because they have been taught that the church has no name. Okay? And then you say, well, what's the name of the family of God? Again, they can't comprehend this because they've been taught that the family of God is the church. Okay? And then you ask, well, what's the name of the nation of God? And they still have a problem, okay? Because the nation of God is the church and it doesn't have a name, right? Well, the congregation of God actually started back in Mount Sinai, and you have this term, the day of the congregation, back in the Torah, and it's talking about Sinai. And in Acts chapter 2, when the congregation supposedly started, we have what's going on there is it is mimicking Sinai, because what it's saying is that this congregation is the congregation of Israel. This is true Israel. Israel has never been genetic, okay? And this is what he gets into in chapter 9, pointing out that true Israel are those who follow the God of Israel, and they become Israel. The family of God, the name of the family of God is Israel, okay? The name of the nation of God is Israel. The name of the congregation of God is Israel, and we join Israel by joining a local church of Israel. And our purpose is to become fully part of Israel, and the training that we're getting in the path is designed to make us fully Israel, meaning that we're going to do all of the laws of the Torah. We're going to live righteously, and we're eventually going to move back to the land and set up the nation of Israel in the millennium. So this is what the congregation is all about. It's connecting us to the people of God. Okay, so we have to find a congregation that fits the instructions of 1 Corinthians. We have to find a congregation that is connected to Israel, true Israel, that follows the God of the Bible. And when we do that, then we're going to be plugged into a discipling congregation that is going to train us to be fully a part of Israel. And this congregation is a resource. It's step number 5, and it is a resource to help us to live righteously. And without this resource, you're going to have trouble living righteously, and that's exactly what you see in people who are joining a congregation that's not doing all these instructions, or not doing the Torah, these kind of things, or they're not plugged into a congregation at all. They're going to have trouble living righteously. They're going to have trouble walking consistently in the Spirit.